stuff set up. Okay, so today is February 15th, 2020. We're going to discuss the whether or not COVID-19 fits the descriptors for sun disease. I'm going to give you some information that I went through yesterday. So I need to set this stuff up because this is the second time I'm going through this. So I'm going to try and sort of step through it quickly. I don't want to miss anything. And I just step through basically hoping I can remember everything from yesterday. So let's see. Back in the day, in the 90s, I wrote some software for educational companies, some of which was licensed by a Japanese firm, specifically a Keiretsu that had production facilities near Yokohama. Keiretsu is like a conglomerate. And I was just working with one subsection that was involved in educational stuff. They also were the Japanese reps for my Vortex software, which allowed people to read extremely fast from computer screens. It was very well received in their specific industrial niche of safety emergency warning signs, because Japanese was particularly well suited to high impact, short words being able to get right to you. Anyway, though, so I had this relationship with this Japanese conglomerate. During that period of time, I developed the web bots, the ALTA reports, the asymmetric linguistic trend analysis. And I came up with that. I went in that really weird, screwy direction. And I was still doing business with the Japanese and a bunch of other firms globally. And as a sort of a Chotsky, I would hand out my reports as I did them to these executives. Japanese guys, they took to them. And they had them all bound up. And another generation of these fellows, people I didn't work with, but who were within the power chain at the time I was working with the company, came along. They're now into more senior management. They contacted me and wanted to do a conference call. I said, sure, what the hell? And they recorded it, and they were willing to provide me some aspects of it after editing. But we discussed a lot of their internal business, so I said, let's not bother. I'll just redo it from the notes that I developed for that discussion. And because I think it's very reasonably valuable, as did they. It's complicated stuff here, though, because we discussed a lot of their private business, none of which I'm going to share. I'm going to be very careful. Hopefully I won't have to edit this. Hopefully I can keep it under an hour. There was a lot of stuff there. It was several hours. And they had live, real-time overdubbing Japanese to what I was saying. And it was driving me nuts. Trying to not hear it as I was speaking, and that affected what I was saying, and it just took forever. Okay, so the reason that they contacted me was they were questioning the extraordinary number of linguistic hits from their viewpoint of the what I had characterized as the sun disease in my old ALTA reports with COVID-19. And I'll share those, okay? I'll share some of these linguistic similarities, and you can see what led them to this understanding. The timing is off, but timing is a bitch, okay? And so the timing in their minds was always separate from the actual forecast, because the predictive aspect of it was not necessarily the timing per se, even though they were attempting to use that for, a commercial gain. They were always more planning far ahead, because they know shit's going to happen anyway. So they so we had this long talk, and what set them off was the early reports of the sun disease and the continual over years, over a decade. Let me see. If we want to just characterize it from as beginning in 2003, when we had the effective split, and I'll explain that in a second, then we're looking at 13 years of the sun disease appearing in the reports, unbidden in the data. And the one of the corollaries in my work that I always followed was the longer it appeared, the further out it was going to have an effect on us, right? There may also have been another subcorollary, is that the further out it would be before it appeared, because we're now getting into it, even though it started hitting the forecast in the data sets in 2003. Actually, earlier than that. I'll explain that in a second. Okay, so there's these two weird things about the sun disease relative to humans. Okay, it was always that the sun disease was emblematic, and the word sun was an emblem relative to the disease, an icon, a symbol. Okay, not simply a word. And so here we find that at this point, and so that was described from 2003 onward, the relationship of the word sun and disease with the forecast for the upcoming manifestation of it. And so the description was that we would have, well, I won't go into the details of that, it takes us too long. At some point I'll get out the old reports and go through them in what was published, because I've got all the raw data in a lot of the sun disease stuff, just because of the nature that it in the way in which it appeared. But in any event, so the Chinese flag is references the sun. Okay, it is an emblem of the sun. Wuhan, the central province in which this was, the Wuhan city, in which this was emergent, manifest, has a really peculiar thing, which is that just a couple of years back, there was a Chinese pop song that was called Sun Quan the Emperor, that was about Wuhan. It was about the formation of Wuhan, the Hubei province area, the beginning of the 1,000 years ago, the beginning of what led to the current shape of China and all of this kind of stuff, right? It was a weird historical song, and it became thereafter, and it described in Chinese literature as emblematic of Wuhan. So they connected the language there. Now, that was always something about the predictive linguistics. We were predicting the appearance of language, not necessarily an event that we now would imagine around that language, right? Because we would have no way of knowing how people would be interpreting words 20 years in the future if we were suggesting that an event would happen 20 years in the future around this language. All we would be projecting is that this language was going to appear, and we could maybe sort of puzzle out what it was about, right? All right, so And it's key that we understand that it's linguistics that we're being forecast, not a description of the event. So this is not prophecy where somebody's got a vision of an event coming out, and they see that event, and then they apply the words to that event description and present you with that. We didn't have that. We had a bunch of words that were being forecast as being of importance at a particular point in the time, and that these words were related, sort of like a giant word cloud. And it would then be up to us several years in advance of that sometimes to try and puzzle out how this word cloud would actually shape up given what was manifesting in our current reality and how it might be expected to unfold. All right, so that's a primer on the linguistics. All right, so we had tons and tons and tons of stuff about sun disease, and it was from the very first report that I did, from the very first data gathering session that I did in 1997, that sun disease popped up. At that point, it showed up because I was attempting to use this technology to forecast stock market prices, and I had chosen and I was working off of the stock ticker symbols, and I had chosen Stanford University Network Computing as my first target. Their symbol was SUN. So it actually went out and looked for sun and brought back all kinds of information, not about Sun, the computer company, but rather about the sun, the big scary ball in the sky, and the effect it was going to have on the planet as we went forward, the disease of the sun. Now later, so that was 97. It was the very first report. It took me a number of years to write the software, figure out what the hell I was doing with that, and I was working on that part of it for at least another 10 years, well into about 2010. because stuff kept changing, and it was difficult to keep track of the alterations within the language. It was a continual burden. We had the censorship, and things kept getting more interesting. In any event, though, so it was a work in progress for well over a decade. But from the very beginning, we had sun disease. It was initially only my assumption, interpreting the data, because of the other data that was associated with the sun, that it was talking about climate. It was through this period from 1997 to 2003 that, that we had all of the initial language that then formed rivers in the sky, atmospheric rivers, lakes in the sky, the catastrophic lake dumps in the sky, giant amounts of rain coming down in a short period of time, like whole years worth of rain in 2 days, that sort of a deal. And the wonkiness of the weather began being predicted in 1997, and through that period in 2003, all of these things seemed to only relate to, and they were always continually associated in the data sets with sun disease, which had become a rather entrenched generalized meme, with generalized mimetic, a continual thread through all of the various different data sets. And it was there all the way through 2003. It wasn't until 2003 that I was able to make some breakthroughs in my processing and was able to begin to start to do more reports than had been previously able, because I was doing reports that were like hundreds of pages at a time, simply because it took so long to gather the data. I was looking for such long-term stuff because there was no point in trying to chase events into the near-term future, although that actually had been my goal with the stock market stuff, right? So anyway, all right, so jump to 2003, we get what I called the split. It was in 2003 that we started getting sun disease applied to a condition that would affect humans. And also continued on. We had the same set continue on with sun disease, all about climate and wonkiness and all of that sort of thing. And so, here, let me, I got to go the other way. All right, so it was up in 2003 that we had the split. But from 1997 until 2016, sun disease was a prominent feature in all of these ALTA reports, these asymmetric linguistic trend analysis reports that I was producing. All right, and during the period of time from 2003 to 2016, there were actually 2 threads of the sun disease, and one of them was all about humans. Now, the thread of sun disease relative to humans that showed up during that period of time was actually from 2003 through 2016 more emotionally intense by the measurements of my my little engine that quantified emotions and put down intensity, duration, spreadability, all different kinds of things. But by the intensity factor, there was much more intense language appearing in this period of time about sun disease affecting humans than about the continual slow grind kind of stuff on our weather. All right, so dropping the aspect of sun disease as weather, we find that from 2003 onward, there were certain key conditions that had never been met in any outbreak. So from 2003 and through to 2016, when I stopped doing the ALTA reports because of the data pollution caused by David Wilcock and Corey Good and those guys, from 2003 to 2016, 13 years, in those ALTA reports, sun disease, as it applied to humans, had continual data sets that had key manifestations, uniquely described manifestations that appeared in no pandemic through that period of time. So it wasn't SARS, it wasn't any of the previous coronaviruses, nothing showed that matched the language of the sun disease as had been described during that period of time. Well, we now have those things appearing now in the last couple of days. And the key aspects of this that we can zero in on just to get into it was around the idea of people collapsing on the street and reeling and suddenly collapsing. Okay, no symptoms, just suddenly collapsing. Another aspect about it was people that were reeling and appeared to be zombie-like, not like, zombies on TV, but out of it in the sense that they were mesmerized or non-functioning. Your mental facilities just aren't working there. And these two elements were predominant in the sun disease descriptions in close conjunction with street lights, light poles. And so here we now have situations where there's actually images emerging and discussions online of people collapsing, grasping around light poles. And not just one person, but repeated instances of this to the point where the language is spreading throughout the internet. So that's what attracted the attention of the Japanese, was the unique descriptions that were coming out that matched the descriptors in the old ALTA reports about the sun disease, which would appear periodically as I wrote about it. But, it was at that time I started getting bored with it because I've been writing about the thing for 13 years, but I've been aware about it for longer than that because I'd been tracking the sun thing since 1997. So its linguistic span was actually quite huge within the body of my work. And I basically took it for granted and didn't even think about it until, rather recently. And we have some other linguistic clues that link sun disease with our current experience with this COVID thing, okay? And these linguistic clues include our old meds being used, and TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And in the reports, there was a key feature was that the way that humans were going to respond to this, our word clouds about the sun disease, there were words about the human response to the sun disease, and one of the responses that kept showing up was the idea we would be returning to way old traditional approaches because of the nature of what we were facing. I'll get into that in a second. Okay, so these other linguistic clues included sudden respiratory problems and asymptomatic respiratory buildups. So you were walking along and all of a sudden your lungs would fill up and you'd collapse over. We're now seeing that in these secondary infections of this disease. So the people that are collapsing on the street, some of them are found to have been or rumored on the internet to have been asymmetric or asymptomatic carriers of the disease, just walking around contagious and infecting people that they didn't even know they had the disease themselves until it builds up and then they collapse on the street. Other people had it, were cured, went back out on the street and doing their regular stuff, got it again, and within a very short period, keeled over. Okay, also now we're seeing this gut storming. That was repeatedly referenced in the old ALTA data, as again the street lights and the collapse together. And then fever as a metric. That was a unique set of language in the ALTA reports about using fevers, not actually using fevers. And here we now see people with the little wands to see if you've got a fever and that's a metric, or whether or not you go to decontamination or whatever, or quarantine. There was other language in there about the variable period for symptoms, about the wide range of effects within humans. And so it would look at one point like we were battling multiple diseases. At other points, it would look like we were merely dealing with regular stuff and we were overreacting. And then it would bloom again, and the overreaction would seem to be, far less than really what's required, and how it was going to be very difficult to deal with. In all of the time that I was dealing with the sun disease stuff, the only thing I ever saw ever show up as an effective response, all centered back to old traditional medicine. So we can consider that as we go forward. Okay, so the second time is more deadly, apparently, if you get it again. So it may not confer immunity through antibiotics or through antibodies the way that we think traditional ones do. Oh, another thing that we're going to see here is that let's get into some of the cultural things. If this is the sun disease that's emerging now, the sun disease descriptors had us having cultural alterations. So it's going to alter global culture, both in patterns in commerce and politics, but also in patterns in culture. So you can forget about shaking hands anymore in Western society. That's going to go away. You'll bow. You'll do some other something. Who knows? Who knows? But you won't be shaking hands. In close contact, people are now going to start extending their personal space and say, wait a second, you're too close, fucker. Don't you dare be spitting next to me, that kind of thing, right? We're going to see new travel. Restrictions first. That's good. The travel industry is going to collapse. We'll get into that in a second. But also we're going to see new stuff related to travel, which would be like antivirus clothing that's for people that have to travel globally. Stuff with silver in it to protect you, that sort of thing. Supply chains are going to be localized over time, but we'll see a lot more raw material shipping and more localized production and stockpiling of raw materials throughout the planet. It's going to alter our planetary diet. We can get into that in another point, and change agriculture, but not directly, only as a result of appearing at this time as we head into the Ice Age from the 2030s on. So the way that I was talking about this the other day with these people that have to plan for it in Japan is that we were talking about short-term impact. And for them, short-term was the next 5 years. And maybe really the way they're thinking about it, the next 9 years. But they're pretty certain that as a culture, we'll be dealing with this for several decades. I agree. They were pretty certain that the most significant impacts would come within the next 5 years. I'm not so certain if we apply a different kind of understanding to the word significance, because the cultural changes will take some of them will take a lot longer to show up, but will be much more meaningful than the early on commercial changes, because the commercial changes will then later on have to play catch up to the cultural changes. So in other words, some of the businesses may make different supply chain decisions now, but the culture changes and they have to play catch up because some of the goods that they were going to use as substitutes or stockpile or whatever are just no longer wanted by that particular culture they're in, and everything becomes much more locally based. All right, just because we will find it easy to transport in a broad sense over a long period of time in our sci-fi world, we will find that it is easier to transport raw materials in bulk to automated finishing plants at various different sites than it is to do finishing in one point, box it all up and all of that kind of stuff, and then ship it and all of that sort of deal, right? Because dealing with decontamination of raw materials is a lot easier than it is in dealing with decontamination of boxed finished goods that go on and on and on, boxes within boxes within boxes within boxes inside shipping containers. So it's going to alter how we do things planet-wide. Over 40 or 50 years. During that period of time, we're also going to be in an ice age. So it's a toss-up as to what's going to affect our agriculture and so on more. But one of the key things about this was that the planetary diet was going to change in relation to the sun disease. But this was the combined effects of the human sun disease and the sun disease itself showing up. Bear in mind, I stopped the ALTA reports when the data sets got too polluted to deal with and had to rapidly shift. In doing so, we sort of lost the thread for sun disease from 2016 onward. So we don't know where it would suggest or what it would suggest at this point. All right, so let's deal with things like travel. So it's going to become all right, so we can put it this way. It will be interesting to see how rapidly here in the United States and in Western Europe we arrive at the decision not to participate in group events. It will be interesting to see who arrives at that decision first. us guys or government. So if it's us guys, we may see a situation where, which may be emerging now, especially as I was talking with my Japanese friends, and seeing stuff happen local here, where all of us guys get a little panicky, all right, that are aware. We start reacting and doing things in a panicky, preppy kind of a situation. Sort of like panic ahead of, let's panic ahead of the government, right? Get there first. And we don't go places. And then the government catches on because they're reactive the way that instead of proactive, because they can never really be proactive. And so it may be that such things in terms of travel restrictions are actually happening now in a self-imposed fashion. And it's going to get a lot worse because of the horror stories that are coming out around the travel industry, right? We heard one yesterday because a friend of Kathy's is on a 4-month luxury trip with her husband. They're old people, and it's around the world. It was, remarkably, I think, entitled Toilets of the World Tour. But it was a luxury cruise. They paid a shitload of money for this. But when you're going to die soon, in terms of the grand scheme of things, you might as well burn up some money. And they were going to go and see the world in a luxurious fashion. And they had all of these ports all over Southeast Asia, Philippines, China, Thailand, Indonesia, all over there. Well, all those got canceled, and they're now being rerouted to some islands in the Indian Ocean. And it's anybody's guess as to whether there's enough stuff there on the islands of the Indian Ocean to feed that ship. But none of the people want to get off of it in Asia, and you can see the problems, right? So the people are freaking out. Viking's trying to do what it can do to keep people safe. So now that's another thing. Okay, so one of the things about the sun disease, continual refrain that kept on going, even back in here before 2003, this is not to scale, people. I was just slashing lines and putting it up and stuff. But back here in 1997 to 2003, when I thought it was just referring to the sun, they kept showing all these things for... It used to be called Article 4, okay? And there were 4 articles, or there were a bunch of articles that you had to go through in this test. And one of them, from the point of Article 4 onward, in this test for merchant marine and other things, they all related to public health and safety, okay? So there's Article 1 about keeping saving the ship, Article 2 about basically, saving all of the people you're working on, Article 3 about, alerting people around you to danger, and then Article 4 was always about public health and safety in the merchant marine tests and things. So that's what we're going to go to again, is that'll become the watchword around the planet. That was one of the things that was seen in the data sets all along. It made no sense when I thought it was just talking about the sun. I thought that was somehow connected to UFOs and shit. Anyway, though. Okay, so some of the things here. The Chinese are showing us that some of the other stuff written about in the ALTA reports is actually manifesting in the current language, like the collapse of the established healthcare system, instantly becoming overwhelmed with the blooms, okay? Because this disease was described in the data sets much more like a fungus than a bacteria, where it had specific kinds of stages of progress through the host community. And these occurred at blooms as it bloomed out in various populations. And then the populations would collapse the way that mycelium eats out all of the stuff directly underneath it that it needs. And so it keeps moving out, leaving a depleted center area for, of the stuff it needed. And so that was the description we get in this. All right, so another thing was that within the old descriptions of the sun disease was not only the suddenness that it appeared, but who it happened to hit and how it was sort of flowing along in the middle parts of the population where a lot of reasonably healthy people. And now we know that, now it's been suggested, it's not for sure, but it's been suggested that the ACE2 system is involved, okay? And because that would be that's where SARS entered the body. And this is a similar disease to that. and presents the same kinds of problems in making vaccines. So don't believe anybody that says they've got a vaccine in 3 hours and you're going to be fine. The ACE2 system is throughout your entire body. It's involved with lots of stuff. The point that SARS was a real problem, though, was what was described in the data as gut storming. We didn't understand at the time that it was within the data sets, and I don't think I adequately described it other than storming. It was never thought to be actual, dysentery or anything, but a sudden depletion of something and you felt wonky and you'd collapse. It was all part of the collapse and grabbing hold of the street thing. Anyway, though, so it's assumed that some of the data around the ACE2 stuff in SARS is applicable here. If that is the case, one of the things you can do, especially for small children, even down into some level of real small children, toddlers, is to provide adequate probiotics on a daily basis. You don't have to overwhelm them. They don't have to have it with every meal. Older people might well do better with a probiotic at every meal, because a probiotic is going to help moderate all of the and plump up all of your ACE2 layer in the gut biome, and will assist you in a number of other ways. Plus, it'll also be antiviral, because if you've got a good, healthy gut bacteria, that also kills all kinds of viruses that may make it in there. So just mentioning this as we go along. Another thing is that chaga is okay for children. At some point, though, you're going to have to look at their body mass and say, well, you're a real small kid. We're going to make this extremely weak and give you just a little bit by tablespoons over the next few days just to see how you do with it. And only do that when you've got the disease in your local area as a response. They have to be, the chaga and the other medicinal mushrooms have to be considered as true drugs. Now, the Japanese guys I was talking to yesterday they've got different probiotics and other antiviral approaches within their normal food chain, a lot of which is the fermented soy, and fermented so to the point where it's black and gooey and stuff, right? And I throw up just even thinking about it. They eat it and nothing happens to them, so they survive with it. But every one of them tell me that their kids basically throw up first couple of times they eat some of these things. But on the other hand, it makes for a very resilient gut, right? You got some serious gut bacteria in there if it goes in black and slimy to start with. So anyway, I don't mean to minimize it. It's just that we're funny humans. But they're also going to start doing weak mushroom tea. Okay, so we're almost done. Hooray, hooray. So we had all kinds of other language that ties this to the sun disease. I won't get into those things. If you've got the old reports, you can go and look at them if you care. I don't think it matters. If indeed we're looking at the sun disease equals the COVID-19 here, then the projection is that we'll be dealing with it in beyond the 2030s, 2040s even. And that it's just going to become part of the sci-fi world, and we're going to have to alter ourselves to react to it, and there'll be continual intermittent springs of it coming out. Now, the awful part is, but bear in mind it only predicts language, not events, is that language was predicted that would show over 1 billion people would perish of this, okay? We don't have any time frames. That language has never been fulfilled, obviously. But a lot of the supporting language is now emerging because it was all tied up into the sun disease sets. But, that might be 1 billion people looking back after, 40 or 50 years of it for all I know. Again, not a good thing, right? Plus, we don't know. I mean, all that is the projection of language. So it may be that mainstream media will publish the figures at that level, predicting at an extreme, it could be at that level. So that's how we get it into our data sets. It's just an extreme, it's just language, it's just a projection that never, ever, ever emerges, and it never, ever, ever gets anywhere near that bad, but it's still horrific nonetheless, even at its smaller level of impact on the social order, or on humanity and its impact on the social order. We're already seeing the impact on the social order with the breakdown of the supply chains. China is now 90% shut down, which is good for the pollution. It's all dropped down to nothing because nobody's driving, nobody's making anything, no one's going to work. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things I want to recommend is that if you've got travel planned, you really seriously think about this, because there's reports of people that I know that have talked to me that say they flew out of LAX in the last few days on planes filled with Chinese that were leaving. They were getting out of China, that had come to the U.S. Some of them had come to the U.S. To LAX and didn't want to, but that was the only flight they could get because the other flights that they were potentially available to them are booked up. Also with other Chinese from wherever they were flying. Some of them are flying out of the Philippines, some of them were flying out of Malaysia. So it's so apparently there's if you've got the money, some of the Chinese have gotten out, and this likely is yet another source of infection spread. In any event, though, so consider that this may indeed be without symptoms for 24 days. That's almost a whole month. So you're walking along, or you go to an event, and so you might get exposed to someone who themselves will show no sign of being ill for maybe a week after that event totally ends. We're at this initial point now, and like I say, it'll be interesting to see. Will it be the people panicking that will not do the travel, and then the government will react here in the U.S., or will the government just all of a sudden go crazy because of a bloom here in the U.S. and clamp down on travel everywhere, trapping people? And that's really the issue, is whether you're going to get trapped in situ, wherever you happen to be, by a quarantine close. The other thing is, if they just shut stuff down and you don't go, big deal. It's not like you've lost much. Okay, so there's a couple of things again. Cautions: stay the hell away from MMS, also known as chlorine dioxide. I think it's a chlorine sulfite that they use to trigger that. But also now we've got people recommending quercetin and glutathione alterations, right? Taking quercetin and glutathione. And I don't know about that, guys, unless they can show you a pathway that actually affects the disease, the virus itself. Those are both going to cause stress to your body. I think you're going to, personally, I want to minimize any stress I can at this point, because I will come in contact with the virus, especially now that if we think about it in an appropriate way, now that we know it's on my continent, and in fact I know it's in my state, we've got some people being observed in San Juan County. If any one of them show as having the disease, then we can presume the whole San Juan County has been somewhat polluted, because the one guy getting there had contact with 19 people in San Juan County, and who knows how many people in the process of transiting from SeaTac. So it'll be here real soon, like in my local area. And thus I need to minimize the stress my body's under. And some of these items, like, you can take quercetin, and if you take enough, you'll get ulcerative colitis. And it's not good for your gut, not long term. It has specific uses. It's a hot substance, an acidic substance, relative to the action of the gut biome, not to be consumed for long periods of time. A lot of herbalists are assholes and idiots because they don't recommend this cycling of the herbs. No matter what they are, you can't take them day in and day out. You need to stop them just to reshock your body the next time you take them into having that more positive effect. And none of them should ever be taken probably longer than 18 months total. I routinely, even on the chaga mushroom, at the end of 16 months, went for 2 weeks without taking it. Big boost when I did return to it again. I'm coughing here because there's dust all over. I was cleaning out yesterday. Okay, so impact on the U.S., impact on travel globally. That'll be one of the next things that'll show up. Everybody's sort of hunkering down. One of the good parts of this, by the way, is it'll be hugely impacting on some rather evil businesses because their supply chains are going to get wonky and they won't be able to produce stuff. So, there's always a little bit of good somewhere. But we're seeing that, by the way, we're seeing the supply chain impacts now, and people might minimize that. That's because of the amount that's in the chain as it's getting closer to them, and when they buy out that last one, it'll run out, and they'll discover how rapidly, at that point, the supply chains degrade. Also, another thing is that one of the things about the sun disease in the ALTA reports was that we would reach a period of time where there would be a bloom in a very weird, at the time, didn't make any sense to me, population sub-demographic, and that would be jet-setting celebrities are going to be disproportionately hit by this. Many of them weakened to the point where, they'll be shells of their former selves. They may survive, I don't know. But we'll see images of them, trying to fight it off. And this is going to be because they go through airports all the time. The very lifestyle is making them go through what's going to become infection central, which are travel hubs. Okay, I guess that's it. There was tons more stuff we talked about yesterday, but I'm tired of going over it all again, and still have my own cleaning up and stuff to do here. You can take, screenshots and that kind of stuff if any of this is important. Next time I'm undoubtedly going to have other stuff to go through. There's a lot of good people out there. You can check out Peak Prosperity guy on YouTube, Chris Martinson. He's got really good solid information. Be careful of people recommending that you take chemicals unless they can tell you this chemical works on this pathway against this virus. If they can't say that, they're basically are butt heads. And would you take advice from a butthead? Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Bye.